This is Alex with Signature Sales and Management, 951rents.com, property management for Krona and the Inland Empire, Temecula, all of it is ours. So today we want to talk about long-term versus short-term leases. Which one is best? That is the question. We all want tenants to stay a long time. We all want them to be comfortable, and we all want it to be on autopilot, right? We just want that residual coming in. We want everyone to be happy. What we're going to look at is it necessarily a good thing to have a long-term lease? You'll be surprised. And we got to weigh the pros and cons. So right now, let's take a look. All right, so when we look at leases, let's look at long-term, anything over a year. So a year and a half, 13 months, 2 years, 3 years. These are long-term leases, right? We're not going to look at annual. We're not going to look at 1 year at a time. We're going to look at anything over a year. When we look at short-term leases, we're going to look at month to month, perhaps, and or 6-month period. 3, 6 month, anything under a year. So that's going to determine the difference between long and short-term. So let's look at the pros of a long-term lease. So first of all, long-term lease can provide stability, right? You know that the tenants are going to stay a while. You know you got them locked in, everybody happy. That's the first thing we all think about, and that's the first thing that is coming up on my radar here. So long-term leases could also reduce costs associated with new tenant move-ins. Every time you get a new tenant, every time a lease is up and someone leaves, you have all the costs associated with preparation, right? We got to prepare the place, we got to paint the place, we got to do whatever we got to do to get a new tenant in. So the second thing I would say is long-term leases can reduce those costs associated. Another thing is long-term tenants may be more responsible and financially stable. So anyone willing to sign a long-term lease is obviously in their own head financially stable and responsible to do so. So let's look at that as the third point. So then the fourth one, we have long-term tenants are likely less to move. Anyone willing to sign a long-term lease, anyone looking to stay there for a while is probably more apt to sign another long-term lease after that one expires. So long-term tenants are less likely to move and might want to renew another long-term lease shortly after. So those are the pros of long-term leases. Let's look at the cons, okay? A long-term lease actually can protect the tenant more so than the owner. Why? Good question. Why? Because it actually prevents the landlord from raising the rent. The tenant is now got a secured rent. He doesn't have to worry about the increase. So that's why it kind of protects the tenant and can be a con against the owner because they cannot raise the rent during this period of time. Specifically, it's 2.5 years. The market goes crazy. There's nothing you can do about it, right? So also, you'll discover if you have bad tenants, a long-term lease can be a bad thing, right? Bad tenants, bad thing. So why? Is because, once again, you're locked in there. So all of a sudden you discover these tenants are horrible and then they're really putting damage to the place. They're making a mess of things. You can't get rid of them. And if you find out they're a real problem, then you're looking at eviction. And or when they move, now you're looking at some costs for the damages incurred. You know, let's say they never mowed the lawn. They were just not doing what they said. Now you can evict during this time if they breach any part of the lease. However, these are the issues you have when you're locked into a lease. So the fourth thing that I would say is a con is longer term tenants can be more reluctant to think about their deposit. When you've been there a long time, you tend to forget that you gave a deposit in the beginning. Thus, you might be more apt to create damage or neglect the property. So that would be the fourth thing. So let's look at all the cons. The pros. Long-term tenants can provide stability. Long-term tenants can reduce costs associated with new tenant move-ins. Long-term tenants may be more responsible and more financially stable. Long-term tenants are less likely to want to move. And let's look at the cons. Long-term leases protect the tenant, right? Because they're locked in and you can't raise the rent on them. If you have bad tenants, you're locked in once again and you can't get rid of them. And long-term tenants are reluctant to think about their deposit. And another thing is tenants may ask for more concessions. So longer-term tenants say, hey, listen, if you want me to sign a long-term lease, you're going to have to fix the gate. You're going to have to get that sink in the back area fixed and put some screens underneath. They're more apt to want concessions in lieu of signing a long-term lease. So that would be another downside or con. So now let's look at the pros for short-term leases, month to month, 6 months, anything under that annual contract, right? So short-term leases can provide higher rents because they're so short and people don't want to sign anything over a month, 6 months, etc. You're more likely to actually increase the rent to make up for some of the costs that you'll have to endure when you're moving people in and out, in and out, and out. So in this case, you can actually create a profitable model. It's just a little bit more work on your part. So that's a good pro. Another one is it's less of a commitment for you, especially if you don't know what you want to do with the property. So let's say you put it up for rent, but it's only because you're not sure what you want to do. Maybe you want to sell it. Maybe you want to rent it. Maybe you want to give it to your brother Joe who's going to come in and mess it up. Either way, it's less of a commitment for the landlord. So that really is another pro. Another one, it's easy to advertise. You know, it's you can put it on Airbnb, VRBO. There's a lot of different websites that you can use for short-term leases. And the last one is it's just lots of flexibility for a landlord. So those are the pros. We got short-term leases provide higher rents. They're less of a commitment, they're easy to advertise, and there's lots of flexibility in short-term leases. Now let's look at the cons, right? So it's an inconsistent cash flow. You're never sure if you're going to get the next person in for another short-term lease. So that's one of the big cons is there's no guaranteed rent. Another thing is short-term tenants provide no stability. So let's look at the opposite of that. There's no stability to that. It does not support a reliable long-term strategy. And then another con would be there's more wear and tear in the property, right? You're moving people in, you're moving people out. There's lots of things going on in there in a short-term basis, and there's more wear and tear. Also higher expenses. So you have preparation costs every time someone moves in and moves out, short-term, month to month, whatever it might be. You might have to clean the carpet every time. So you're cleaning the carpet more so than most people might, or painting or whatever it might be. Also, it can also rely heavily on the tourism industry. So if you're in an area where there is a lot of short-term rents going on, you kind of have to heavily rely on tourists. Otherwise, having that type of a business model with a rental might not be a conducive strategy for you. So every landlord must evaluate the strategy, whether it's short-term, long-term lease. Always look at the rents in your area and have a good basis for your rent. Always look at the market analysis. Don't go above what market rents are. That way, if someone is in a long-term lease and as soon as the lease is up, everyone starts searching, right? Or at least kind of wants to see what's out there. If your rent's priced right there with the rest of the rents in the area, they're less likely to move. So your long-term strategy is effective. If it's a short-term strategy, that's a whole other animal. You might want to do a little bit more research in your area and see what type of people are coming in and out of the area. If it's touristic or maybe it's a different type of area, it's up to you. Maybe some college kids or something. But no one wants to go through the painstaking process of a move. It's always recommended to do a good tenant screening, do background checks, make sure that everyone's up to par when you're renting to these individuals to prevent damage, and obviously a lot of other pros and cons to that. But do what makes sense for you, right? It's good to have a tenant with you for a long time. If someone's been there for a year and they seem to be a good tenant, offer them a long-term strategy. You know, offer them a lease agreement. Maybe even offer to lower the rent or keep it the same if they sign a long-term lease. And this is, of course, someone that you've done business with in terms of your rental and it's been there for a period of time. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. You're locking them in. You don't have to worry. It's on autopilot and you know they're good tenants. My name is Alex. This is Signature Sales and Management, 951rents.com. Property management for Corona, Temecula, and the Inland Empire. Have yourself a great day.